"You're here to manage the household, not emotions," Evelyn Davenport said. The words were clipped precise, like the sharp, unforgiving edges of the glass coffee table that separated them. "Don't get attached." Mara simply inclined her head, a gesture so slight it was almost imperceptible. There was no argument in her posture, no flicker of resentment in her eyes. Her uniform, a tailored ensemble in shades of charcoal and slate, was immaculate, a study in professional neutrality. Her true response, as always, was not in words but in her work. She turned to leave the cavernous living room, a space so grand and sparsely furnished it felt more like a modern art gallery than a home. The white marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, reflecting the cold, architectural precision of the furniture. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound as she moved across the vast expanse. But as she walked, her eyes performed a silent, constant sweep, a diagnostic scan of an environment others only inhabited. Her path deviated by a few inches. She paused, and the toe of her simple black shoe nudged the edge of a sprawling Persian rug. The silk fibers, a river of muted blues and creams, had been shifted by a passing foot, creating a subtle, almost invisible ripple in the pattern. It was a flaw of less than an inch, but to Mara, it was a clear and present danger, a tripping hazard for a small child who might come running through the room, his mind on a game, not on the floor beneath him. She smoothed it flat with an expert motion before continuing on. A few steps later, her hand rose, almost unconsciously, to a sleek control panel embedded in the wall. Her fingers danced over the cool surface for a moment. Across the room, the towering floor-to-ceiling automated blinds hummed to life, adjusting by a mere fraction of a degree. A sliver of the harsh afternoon sun, which had been cutting across the room to cast a blinding glare on the tablet clutched in her employer's son's hands, was now softened, diffused into a gentle, ambient glow. She performed these micro-corrections without breaking stride, a ghost of efficiency moving through a house that ran on such invisible interventions. She was the system's quiet regulator, the unseen hand that ensured seamlessness, comfort, and safety. Across the room, 8-year-old Leo Davenport's fingers stilled on the glass screen of his device. He was a small, silent satellite in the vast, lonely orbit of his parents' lives, his dark hair falling across a face that was perpetually serious. He hadn't looked at his mother as she spoke. He had been watching Mara. He saw her fix the rug. He felt the light change, easing the strain on his eyes. He saw things his parents never did, noticing the quiet competence that flowed from her like a steady, invisible current. His gaze followed her, intense and unblinking. It wasn't the look of a child watching a servant. It was the look of a student watching a master, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, unspoken language of details. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a monument to wealth and order, but it was devoid of warmth. The art on the walls had been chosen by a consultant for its investment potential, not for love. The silence was not peaceful but empty, punctuated only by the distant hum of the climate control system and the faint, rhythmic tap of Evelyn Davenport's pen against her own tablet. It was a perfect house, but it was not a home. Mara could feel Mrs. Davenport's gaze on her back as she neared the doorway, a silent, final warning to remember her place. She kept her expression neutral, her movements fluid and deliberate. The words had been a clear boundary marker, a rule of engagement in a world where her humanity was considered a potential complication, a liability to be managed. Would you endure this? To be seen only for what you can fix and to be warned against feeling anything for the people you serve? The question settled in her mind, not with anger but with a familiar, quiet resignation. This was the job. This was the world she navigated. She slipped through the doorway, a silent exit that left the room exactly as it should be, perfect, orderly, and sterile. Behind her, Leo continued to stare at the empty space she had just occupied, his eyes tracing the path of the only person who seemed to truly understand that a home was not about how it looked, but how it felt. And in that moment, for the first time all day, the vast, cold room felt a little less safe, a little less perfect, now that she was gone. The quiet hum of the house seemed louder, the silence more profound. He was alone again, in a flawless room, waiting for the only person who knew how to fix the things no one else could see were broken. A week later, the cavernous living room was filled, not with silence but with the brittle laughter and forced pleasantries of a small family gathering. Evelyn's sister and her husband were visiting, people whose wealth was older and quieter, but whose judgment was sharper. They sat on the white leather sofas like judges, their gazes sweeping the room, cataloging every flawless surface, every expensive object. Mara moved along the periphery of the conversation, a silent wraith refilling glasses of sparkling water and offering a tray of delicate, geometrically perfect canapés. She was an extension of the house itself, functional, silent, and utterly ignorable. "Evelyn, your staff is just remarkable," her sister Beatrice commented, her voice dripping with the condescending admiration of someone who has never had to manage their own affairs. She watched Mara place a fresh linen coaster on the table. "She's like a little machine. Does she speak?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken assumptions. Evelyn offered a thin, dismissive smile. "She's efficient. That's all that matters." The words, though not aimed at Mara, landed like stones. To be praised for being machine-like was to be praised for the absence of her own humanity. She felt the familiar heat of erasure, the sensation of being looked at but not seen. Leo, sitting on a stiff chair in the corner, his tablet a shield against the adult world, flinched. His mother's words, meant to be a statement of control, sounded like a dismissal of the one person in the house who brought him any sense of calm. The overlapping conversations grew louder, the laughter sharper. The tension in the room, a cocktail of familial rivalry and social performance, began to coil tighter. Suddenly, Leo made a small, sharp sound, a gasp for air in a room that was suffocating him. His eyes were wide, fixed on the shifting, talking faces of the adults. His breathing grew shallow, his knuckles white where he gripped his tablet. A panic attack was descending, a silent, terrifying storm that only he could feel. Evelyn and her husband, Charles, were instantly at his side, their concern cloying and ineffective. "Leo, what is it? Use your words. Breathe, son, just breathe." Their fussing only fed the rising panic, their presence another layer of pressure. Beatrice leaned in. "Is he always like this, so sensitive?" The therapist's techniques, the breathing exercises, the grounding methods, all of it evaporated from Leo's mind. The room was closing in. Just then, Mara re-entered from the kitchen, her movements as calm and unhurried as ever. She was there to clear the empty glasses, a routine task, but her presence immediately altered the room's emotional temperature. She didn't look at Leo, didn't speak to him. She simply began her work, her quiet industry, a pocket of normalcy in the escalating drama. Her focus was on her task, but her awareness was entirely on the boy. Leo's frantic gaze locked onto her. He watched the steady, rhythmic motion of her hands as she collected the glasses. He saw the soft, familiar gray of the hand-knit scarf she wore draped over her shoulders. The house was always chilled to a precise 68 degrees. He focused on the simple, repetitive pattern of the knit, a tangible piece of order in the chaos of his mind. The scent of lavender and cedar that clung to her, faint and clean, seemed to cut through the cloying perfumes of the other adults. His breathing began to slow. The terrible, crushing weight on his chest lessened. He was still in the storm, but now there was an anchor. Mara finished her task and left as silently as she had come. The moment she was gone, Leo's breath hitched again, but the worst of the wave had passed. He had found his lighthouse. No one else had noticed the exchange. They saw only a maid clearing a table while a child had a difficult moment. But Evelyn saw it. She saw her son's eyes follow Mara out of the room. She saw the subtle easing of his panic in the woman's presence. And in her mind, it was not a moment of relief, but a moment of profound and unsettling usurpation. The machine was becoming something more, and it was a development she could not, and would not, tolerate. The charity gala was Charles Davenport's magnum opus, a meticulously planned affair designed to cement his status as not just a titan of industry, but a philanthropist. For weeks, the house was a whirlwind of frantic energy. Florists, caterers, and lighting technicians swarmed through the halls, their frantic activity a stark contrast to Mara's methodical calm. She moved through the chaos, a silent force of order. She saw the logistical flaws before they became problems, the overloaded circuits in the West Wing, the bottleneck at the main entrance that would cause a disastrous guest pile-up. She drafted a simple, elegant solution for the guest flow, a revised floor plan that would ease congestion and improve access to the emergency exits. She presented it quietly to Mr. Davenport one morning, laying the hand-drawn schematic on his desk. "Sir, I was thinking about the arrival of the guests." He glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Mara, your job is to handle the aftermath, not the planning." He pushed the paper back toward her, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Stick to dusting, please. We have professionals for this." The humiliation was sharp but familiar. She nodded, took her drawing, and retreated. She had offered her competence, and it had been rejected because of her uniform. The professionals, she knew, would not see the flaws until it was too late. If you were in her shoes, having seen a disaster in the making, what would you do next? That night, the house was still. The frantic energy of the day had subsided, leaving behind a deep, humming silence. But it was a silence shattered by a piercing scream from Leo's room. Mara was in the main kitchen, double-checking the catering inventories for the third time when the cry echoed through the house. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She heard the Davenports' bedroom door fly open, heard their panicked footsteps on the marble floor. But her own feet were already moving, her instincts pulling her not toward the sound, but toward the place a frightened child would run. She found him in the cavernous, dimly lit pantry. He had bypassed his parents' open door entirely, seeking a different kind of sanctuary. He was trembling, his small body racked with sobs, his face pale in the faint light. He launched himself at her, burying his face into the soft fabric of her apron. His small hands weren't just holding on, they were gripping, anchoring himself to her. One hand was tangled in the folds of her gray scarf, twisting the soft wool into a knot. "The shadows," he whispered, his voice ragged. "They had faces." Mara didn't say anything. She simply knelt, wrapping her arms around him, holding him steady as the waves of his nightmare receded. She was a bulwark against the darkness, her steady presence a silent promise of safety. That was how Evelyn Davenport found them. She stood framed in the pantry doorway, a silk robe clutched at her throat. She saw her son, her only child, clinging not to her but to the maid. She saw his desperate grip on the gray scarf as if it were a lifeline. She didn't yell. She didn't rush forward. Her face, illuminated by the cold light from the hall, was a mask of ice. The fury was there, but it was a quiet, glacial rage. In her eyes, this was not a woman comforting a frightened child. This was a subordinate who had stolen her son's affection. This was a line that had been irrevocably crossed. The unspoken battle for influence, for relevance in her own child's life, had just been declared, and for Mara, there was no turning back. She was no longer just an efficient machine. She was a threat. The day of the gala arrived, and with it, a symphony of controlled chaos. An army of staff in black uniforms buzzed through the Davenport residence, their movements sharp with anxiety. Mara, in her simple gray, moved among them like a river stone, calm and unperturbed by the currents swirling around her. She was on mop-up duty, literally and figuratively, tasked with ensuring the house remained pristine even as it was overrun. The crisis struck at 6 p.m., just as the first guests were scheduled to arrive. A panicked young man from the catering company, his face ashen, burst into the kitchen where the head chef was barking orders. "The server is down," he stammered, holding up a tablet with a black screen. "The cloud, it's not syncing. We've lost everything." A cold silence fell over the kitchen. "Everything," the chef growled. "The seating charts, the meal timings, the allergy lists." The last two words hung in the air like a death sentence. Among the 300 guests were diplomats, CEO, and celebrities, a minefield of dietary restrictions and life-threatening allergies. To serve the wrong canapé to the wrong person could mean a medical emergency, a lawsuit, a public relations disaster that would tarnish the Davenport name for years. Panic erupted. Voices were raised. Fingers were pointed. Charles Davenport stormed into the kitchen, his face thunderous. "What is the meaning of this? You told me your system was foolproof." As the meltdown intensified, Mara, who had been quietly polishing wine glasses in a corner, set down her cloth. She walked over to a small, unassuming binder she kept on a shelf with other household manuals. She opened it to a tabbed section marked Gala. Inside, in her neat, precise handwriting, were several pages of meticulously organized tables. She approached the head chef, her voice low and steady, a calm island in the sea of hysteria. "Chef, I have a hard copy." He stared at her, then at the pages she held out. It was all there. Every guest, their table number, and a column for dietary notes. Red asterisks marked the high-risk individuals. "Ambassador Dubois, table 7, anaphylactic to shellfish," Mara said, pointing to the line. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, table 12, severe nut allergy. And Mr. Chen's son, the one with the celiac, he's at table 3. She had cross-referenced the digital list with the paper RSVPs 2 days prior, a redundant check she performed out of habit. She had noticed a discrepancy in the digital file for one guest and decided to maintain her own analog backup, just in case. It was the kind of unseen, unasked-for diligence that defined her work. It was the work of someone who understood that systems, no matter how advanced, are only as reliable as their weakest link. The chef grabbed the pages as if they were a holy text. The junior staffer who had seen her with the binder earlier stared at her, his mouth agape. He had assumed she was just checking cleaning schedules. He had seen competence, but he hadn't recognized it. The crisis was averted. The kitchen staff, armed with Mara's list, moved with renewed purpose. Charles Davenport saw the relief, saw the problem being solved. He clapped the junior staffer on the back. "Good work, son. Quick thinking. You saved us." He never even looked at Mara. She simply retrieved her binder and went back to her wine glasses, her expression unchanged. The roar of the coming party was beginning to build, but for a moment, the only sound she heard was the quiet hum of a disaster that never happened. She had saved them, and no one had even seen her do it. By 9 o'clock, the gala was a roaring success. The house pulsed with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. For the guests, it was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and influence. For Leo, it was a sensory nightmare. The crush of people, the cacophony of voices, the dizzying array of perfumes and flashing lights. It was an assault. He had tried to be the son his parents wanted, standing beside them in his perfectly tailored little suit, shaking hands and murmuring hello. But after an hour, the facade had cracked. He had vanished into the crowd. Evelyn and Charles, deep in conversation with a senator, didn't notice his absence for nearly 20 minutes. When they did, a quiet, controlled panic set in. They dispatched the household security, men with discreet earpieces to sweep the grounds. "He does this sometimes," Evelyn explained to a concerned guest, her voice tight. "He likes to find quiet corners." But the quiet corners, the library, the solarium, his own bedroom, were all empty. The search grew more urgent. The polished surface of the party was beginning to show cracks of real-world fear. Mara, who was clearing plates in the service hallway, knew. She hadn't seen Leo leave, but she felt his absence. She knew his patterns, his triggers, his deep-seated need for true silence, not just the absence of conversation. The security team was searching the spaces of the house. Mara knew Leo would have sought an escape from the house itself, a place that was not on any floor plan. She slipped out a back door into the cool night air and made her way to the small, detached utility building that housed the backup generator and her own modest changing room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was Spartan, a simple locker, a small bench, and a hook for her coat. Leo was huddled on the floor, his back against the cool metal of her locker. On the hook above him hung her coat, and clutched in his hands, pressed against his face like a talisman, was her soft gray scarf. The air in the tiny room was filled with its faint, clean scent. He looked up as she entered, his eyes wide but not frightened. He wasn't hiding from her. He had run to a place that represented her. "It's too loud," he whispered. It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. Mara didn't scold him or rush him back to his parents. She simply sat on the bench, leaving a comfortable space between them. She didn't speak. She just shared the silence with him. In her presence, the roaring beast of the party receded to a distant hum. Here in this small, plain room, there was safety, there was peace. After a few minutes, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "It's quiet here." "Yes," she replied softly. "It is." Their bond, forged in silent observation and quiet comfort, was now cemented with words. It was their secret, a shared language of safety that no one else could understand. When she finally led him back to the house, he kept the scarf clutched in his hand, a tangible piece of the calm he had found. He handed it back to her just before they entered the light, a secret pact passing between them. He was returned to his parents, who were flooded with relief, never asking where he had been, only that he was back. But Mara knew. She hadn't just found a lost boy, she had been recognized as his sanctuary. The incident at the gala did not go unnoticed. Leo's therapist, Dr. Albright, a woman with a perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair and a vocabulary of weaponized psychobabble, had been a guest. She had witnessed Leo's disappearance and his subsequent, uncharacteristic calm upon his return. She made an appointment with the Davenports the following Monday. They sat in the sterile white living room, the scene of so many of Mara's invisible interventions. Dr. Albright held a leather-bound notepad, her pen poised like a scalpel. "I was, of course, concerned by Leo's flight response during the event," she began, her tone smooth and authoritative. "But what I find more clinically significant is the regulatory object he has chosen." Evelyn and Charles exchanged a confused look. "Regulatory object?" Charles asked. "Something he uses to self-soothe," the therapist explained. "A blanket, a toy. In this case it appears to be your maid, Mara." The word maid was pronounced with a clinical distaste. "We've observed that Leo's anxiety levels decrease significantly when she is present. While this may seem positive on the surface, it points to a potentially damaging transference dependency." This was the trap. She was taking something pure, a child's trust, a woman's quiet kindness, and reframing it as a psychological pathology. She was using the language of her profession not to heal but to control. "Mara is creating an unprofessional attachment," Dr. Albright continued, her words weaving a neat, convincing narrative. "Leo is beginning to see her as his primary source of emotional safety. This is not only inappropriate, given her role in your household, but it actively undermines your parental authority. It's a classic case of a caregiver overstepping their bounds, creating a dynamic where the child's reliance on them gives them an unhealthy level of influence. Have you ever seen a rule or a piece of professional jargon used like a weapon, a way to take something good and twist it into something wrong?" Evelyn Davenport seized on the therapist's words. They gave a name, a clinical justification, for the jealousy and unease she had been feeling. It wasn't that she was failing as a mother, it was that Mara was manipulating her son. "She's a household manager, not a nanny," Evelyn said, her voice hard. "We have you for his emotional needs." "Precisely," Dr. Albright affirmed, sensing her victory. "For Leo to make genuine progress, to form a secure attachment with you, his parents, this external dependency must be severed. The boundaries need to be reestablished. Firmly." The diagnosis was delivered, the trap sprung. Mara's quiet care, her greatest and most humane quality, had been successfully pathologized. She was no longer a comfort, she was a contamination. The Davenports now had a professional, clinical reason to do what their own insecurity had been urging them to do all along: push Mara out of their son's life. The path was clear, paved with the cold, hard certainty of a medical opinion that served their own emotional needs far more than their child's. The confrontation came the next morning. Evelyn summoned Mara to the study, a room paneled in dark, unforgiving mahogany. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and new ultimatums. "Mara," Evelyn began, foregoing any preamble, "Dr. Albright has raised some concerns." She laid out the therapist's verdict in cold, clear terms. The words unprofessional attachment, dependency, and overstepping were used like bricks, building a wall between Mara and the boy she had come to care for. "Your role in this household is to ensure its smooth operation," Evelyn concluded, her voice devoid of emotion. "It is not to be a companion to my son. From now on, you will limit your interactions with him to what is strictly necessary. You will not engage him in conversation. You will not comfort him. You will maintain a professional distance. Is that understood?" It was not a question. It was an order. Mara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. Inside, a quiet storm of grief and indignation was raging, but her face was a mask of placid compliance. To argue would be to prove their point, to show the very attachment they were condemning. The only way to navigate the trap was to walk into it. "Yes, Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice even. "Understood." The isolation was immediate and absolute. Mara became a ghost in the house again, her movements confined to the tasks of cleaning and organizing. She would see Leo in the halls, a small, sad figure, his eyes pleading with her. She would offer him a small, sad smile and keep walking. Every instinct in her screamed to kneel to ask him what was wrong, to offer the simple, human comfort he so clearly needed. But she followed the rules. She kept her distance. What would you sacrifice to stay true to your own integrity, even when you're being punished for it? Leo, in turn, began to wither. The light that had started to return to his eyes dimmed. He stopped speaking almost entirely, communicating in shrugs and monosyllables. He refused to engage with Dr. Albright, sitting through their sessions in stony silence. He knew who had been taken from him, and he knew who had orchestrated it. He began leaving small, heartbreaking tokens for Mara to find. A favorite toy left on her neatly made bed, a drawing of two figures holding hands tucked into her cleaning cart. They were messages in a bottle from a boy marooned on the island of his parents' anxieties. The all-is-lost moment arrived a week later. Leo had a complete meltdown in front of Evelyn's charity luncheon guests. It was a raw, primal scream of frustration and loss that sent the immaculately dressed women scurrying for their cars. In his rage, he had thrown a toy truck, cracking the large pane of glass in the living room window. Evelyn, humiliated and furious, confronted Mara in the kitchen afterward. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You created this addiction. Now look what's happened." Mara didn't defend herself. She simply looked at the woman before her, a woman so blinded by pride and fear that she was destroying her own son. She absorbed the blame, the injustice, the sheer wrongness of it all. She retreated into the quiet fortress of her dignity, her silence a vow. She would endure this. She would follow their rules. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the system they had created was not just failing, it was breaking. And soon, something far more important than a window was going to shatter. The shattering came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon. A storm had been brewing all day, the sky a bruised purple-gray. The wind howled around the corners of the great house, rattling the newly replaced window pane in its frame. Inside, a different kind of storm was breaking. It started with a flicker of the lights, then a pop, and then darkness. A blown transformer somewhere down the line. The house's emergency generator was supposed to kick in instantly, but it sputtered, coughed, and died. A frantic call to the maintenance company revealed the truth. The fuel line, which Mara had noted as needing inspection on a maintenance report a month ago, a report that was subsequently ignored, had failed. The house was dead in the water. In the ensuing chaos, no one noticed the smell at first, a faint, acrid scent like burning plastic. It was Mara, navigating the darkened halls with a flashlight, who traced it to the kitchen. A surge from the failing power grid had fried the wiring on a new, industrial-grade refrigerator installed for the gala. A small, insidious electrical fire was smoldering within the wall, smoke beginning to seep from behind the baseboards. She immediately hit the fire alarm, its piercing shriek slicing through the storm's roar. Staff, disoriented in the dark, began to panic. Evelyn and Charles, their faces illuminated by the frantic beams of their phone flashlights, ran for Leo's room. It was empty. His bed was neatly made. His tablet was on the nightstand, but the boy was gone. "Leo," Charles bellowed, his voice echoing in the dark, cavernous house. Sheer, primal terror gripped him. The fire alarm, the darkness, the storm, and his son was missing. Evelyn's composure finally cracked. "Check the library, the playroom, someone find him." But Mara remained calm. This is where everything could flip. She knew this was not a moment for panic, but for knowledge. She knew Leo. She knew his fears, his patterns, his sanctuaries. He wouldn't be in the library or the playroom. Those were his parents' spaces. He would be somewhere he felt safe, somewhere logical, somewhere he associated with control and order amidst chaos. While a staff member with a fire extinguisher attacked the smoldering wall, Mara grabbed her own heavy-duty flashlight from a utility closet. She didn't run. She moved with purpose. She ignored the shouts and the panic. She bypassed all the obvious rooms, all the designated safe zones. She was heading for the one place no one else would ever think to look, a place that held no comfort for anyone but a small boy who had once seen a quiet, competent woman bring order to chaos there. She descended the stairs to the basement, her flashlight beam cutting a steady path through the oppressive darkness. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of damp concrete and dust. At the far end of the long, unfinished room was a small metal door, the circuit breaker room. She reached for the handle, her heart not pounding with fear but with a steady, certain resolve. She was going to find him. The metal door opened with a low groan, revealing a small, windowless space, a concrete box filled with the orderly, intimidating presence of the house's electrical nervous system. And there, huddled in the far corner, tucked behind a thicket of insulated conduits, was Leo. He was curled into a tight ball, his knees drawn up to his chest. He wasn't crying. His eyes were wide, fixed on the red and green lights of the breaker panel, the only illumination in the pitch-black room. He was terrified, but it wasn't the fire that scared him. It was the alarm, the shrieking, unpredictable noise that had shattered his world. Here, in the heart of the house's electrical system, the noise was slightly muffled, the chaos contained, and clutched in his hands, held tight against his chest, was the gray scarf. He must have retrieved it from her room sometime in the last few days, a secret act of defiance. It was his last link to the feeling of safety. Mara didn't rush toward him. She simply stood in the doorway, her flashlight beam angled at the ceiling to provide a soft, indirect light. She lowered herself to the floor, cross-legged, mirroring his posture from a safe distance. "It's a loud noise, isn't it?" she said, her voice a low, calm murmur that barely disturbed the air. Leo flinched at the sound of her voice, then slowly uncurled, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. He nodded, his grip on the scarf tightening. "It's the fire alarm," she explained, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were describing the weather. "It's supposed to be loud to make sure everyone hears it. It means help is coming. It's a helper noise." She was reframing the terror, giving it a name and a purpose. She was creating a pocket of safety in the middle of the crisis. She saw the logic of why he was there. In his mind, this was the room where the power was controlled. He had seen her here once, calmly flipping a tripped breaker, her actions precise and certain. He had run to the source of control. Just then, footsteps thundered down the basement stairs. The beams of half a dozen flashlights sliced through the darkness. Charles and Evelyn arrived at the doorway, followed by the fire chief. They stopped dead, their frantic energy colliding with the profound stillness of the scene before them. They didn't see a maid and a child. They saw a tableau of perfect, unshakable trust. They saw their terrified son, not hysterical, but listening intently to the one person who had been forbidden from speaking to him. They saw his white-knuckled grip on her scarf. Did you feel that shift? The moment the entire story turned on its axis, Charles Davenport lowered his flashlight. The fire chief, a man accustomed to chaos, simply watched, recognizing a scene of control that had nothing to do with hoses and axes. Evelyn stood frozen, the therapist's words about unprofessional attachment turning to ash in her mind. What she was witnessing wasn't pathology. It was salvation. Charles took a step forward. "Leo," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Leo looked at his father, then back at Mara. He didn't move. It was Mara who spoke. "He's all right, Mr. Davenport. He just needed a quiet place to understand the noise." Her voice was steady. Her gaze was clear. She held all the power in the room, and she had gained it not by raising her voice, but by lowering it. She was not just the household manager. She was not just the help. She was the system's true north, the quiet, competent center around which their chaotic world revolved. And for the first time, they all saw it. The next day, the house was unnaturally quiet. The storm had passed, the fire was a minor, forgotten incident, and the power was restored. The only lingering damage was to the Davenport certainty. They sat across from Mara at the grand dining room table, a space usually reserved for state dinners, not staff meetings. The air was thick with unspoken admissions of failure. Dr. Albright had been dismissed via a curt, early-morning phone call. "Mara," Charles began, his usual booming confidence replaced by a humbled, uncertain tone. "What we saw yesterday in the basement," he trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his realization. Evelyn spoke, her voice strained. "We were wrong. We listened to the wrong person. I was wrong." They offered her everything. A new title, household director and child wellness coordinator. A salary that would triple her current one. A new suite of rooms in the main house. They were trying to fix the problem the only way they knew how, by throwing money and status at it. They were offering her a promotion out of the role she had perfected. Mara listened patiently, her hands resting calmly on the table. When they had finished, she shook her head gently. "Thank you," she said, and the sincerity in her voice surprised them. "But I don't need a new title, and my room is fine." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "I need you to learn my system." Charles frowned. "Your system? What system?" "The work you don't see," she explained. "The habit of observing, the practice of anticipating a need before it becomes a crisis. Checking the fuel line on the generator before the storm comes. Noticing the way the light hits Leo's screen. Understanding that a loud noise is more frightening to him than a small fire. That is the system. It's not about managing a house. It's about creating a home." Her request was not for personal gain. It was for systemic change. It was a form of soft justice, healing over revenge. She wasn't asking for an apology or a reward. She was asking them to become participants in their own lives, to take responsibility for the emotional and logistical labor she had been performing in secret. "I don't want a promotion," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I want you to learn the work, because the work is what matters. What does real justice look like here? Is it a bigger paycheck, or is it a fundamental change in how people see and value the work you do?" The Davenports were stunned into silence. She had refused their offer of power and instead handed them a challenge of character. She was asking them to change not her circumstances, but themselves. It was a far more profound and far more difficult proposition. Charles looked at his wife, whose own eyes were shining with a startling, newfound clarity. He was a CEO who managed thousands of people and billion-dollar deals, but in that moment, he realized he had no idea how his own home truly worked, and the only person who could teach him was the woman they had tried so hard to keep in her place. The Davenports, to their credit, accepted Mara's challenge. The restitution was not a check written or a title granted. It was a process, a complete overhaul of their domestic philosophy. At Mara's guidance, they began to learn the Mara method. She created a document, but it wasn't the simple binder she had kept before. It was a true household manual, a guide not to cleaning schedules, but to the rhythms of the house and the people in it. The policy was named simply, the principle of quiet observation. It had sections on sensory triggers, logistical foresight, and emotional safety protocols. It listed things like optimal light levels for afternoon reading and acoustic buffer zones during high-stress periods. It was the codification of care. The most significant and specific change was the implementation of a new family ritual, the evening reset. Every night at 8 p.m. For 15 minutes, the family would move through the house together. It wasn't about tidying up. It was about preparing the environment for the next day, an act of proactive care that Mara had always done alone. They would check that Leo's favorite book was on his nightstand. They would dim the lights in the hallways to a softer, less jarring level. They would ensure the coffee machine was ready for the morning rush. It was a small, simple practice, but it was revolutionary. It forced them to see the house not as a backdrop for their lives, but as an active participant in their well-being. It taught them the language of foresight. The owner of this new policy was the family itself, and its enforcement was the tangible sense of peace it brought to their home. The impact rippled beyond the walls of the estate. Charles, humbled and inspired, began applying the principle of quiet observation at his own company. He started doing something he had never done before. He would spend an hour each week just walking the floors, not talking, just watching. He noticed the frustration in a department where the software was outdated, the fatigue in a team that had too much fluorescent light and not enough sunlight. He started fixing the small problems, the invisible frictions that were slowly grinding down his workforce. He didn't announce a grand new initiative. He just started practicing quiet care. The productivity and morale of his company began to shift, slowly but surely. Would this change be enough in your workplace? Back at home, the resistance to this new way of life didn't vanish overnight. There were evenings when the Davenports were tired and wanted to skip the reset, times when their old habits of delegation and dismissal tried to reassert themselves. But the path was open. The new system was in place, and its chief architect was still there, not as a director giving orders, but as a quiet guide, reminding them with her steady presence that the most important work was the work of paying attention. Weeks turned into months. The house began to breathe differently. The sterile silence was replaced by a softer, more lived-in quiet. The evening reset had become an ingrained habit, a comforting ritual that anchored their days. One bright, cloudless afternoon, Mara was sitting on a stone bench in the garden, reading a book. It was her scheduled break, a period of rest that the Davenports now insisted upon, understanding that the system needed its regulator to be rested. The garden, once a manicured and untouchable showpiece, now had a small section with a slightly wild, overgrown vegetable patch that Leo had started with Mara's help. Leo came out of the house and walked over to the bench. He didn't say a word. He simply sat down beside her, his small shoulder almost, but not quite, touching hers. He held a book of his own. For a long time they just sat there together, sharing the comfortable silence, the warmth of the sun on their faces. Around his neck was a new scarf. It was a smaller version of Mara's, the same soft gray, but this one had a few clumsy, uneven stitches, a testament to his mother's determined, novice knitting efforts. He no longer needed Mara's original one. The safety she represented was no longer an external object to be clung to, but an internal feeling he now carried with him. The symbol had been transferred. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Mom says you taught her how to see things." Mara looked up from her book and smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached her eyes. It was a smile free from the weight of being watched, judged, or misunderstood. "I think she taught herself," she replied. "Sometimes you just need someone to show you where to look." This was her healing. It wasn't in a grand apology or a public vindication. It was here, in this quiet moment of shared peace. It was in the boy beside her, no longer a silent, anxious child, but a calm, curious one. It was in the feel of the sun on her skin, in the freedom to simply sit and be, no longer a ghost of efficiency but a respected, valued presence. Her dignity, once a shield she held up against the world, had become a quiet comfort she could now share. She had reclaimed not just her place in the house, but her definition of self. She was not the maid. She was not the household manager. She was Mara, and for the first time in a very long time that felt like more than enough, whose voice helped you heal when no one else was there to clap for your victory. The true measure of the change in the Davenport household was not in how they treated Mara in private, but in how they defined her to the outside world. The opportunity came when Charles brought home a senior board member, a gruff, old-money industrialist named Arthur Kensington, for a private dinner. In the past, Mara would have been an invisible presence, serving the meal and disappearing. This time, as she brought the first course to the table, Charles paused his conversation. "Arthur," he said, his voice calm and clear, "I'd like you to meet someone." Kensington looked up, a flicker of surprise on his face. He saw Mara in her simple, elegant gray uniform, and his mind instantly supplied a label, the help. "This is Mara," Charles continued, his next words deliberately chosen. He didn't say, "This is our household manager," or "This is our head of staff." He didn't use a title at all. He said, "She taught us how our home works." The statement was simple, profound, and utterly unexpected. It reframed her value completely. It wasn't about her role or her tasks. It was about her wisdom, her impact. It was a recognition of her as a teacher, a strategist, the architect of their newfound peace. Arthur Kensington was momentarily speechless. He looked from Charles's sincere face to Mara's calm, dignified expression. He was a man who understood systems, power, and influence. He recognized instantly that Charles was not making a polite gesture. He was stating a fundamental truth about his own life. This woman, in her simple uniform, held a unique and powerful position. "A pleasure to meet you, Mara," Kensington said, and for the first time that evening his gruff voice held a note of genuine respect. Mara simply nodded. "Mr. Kensington." It wasn't a grand public speech. There was no applause. It was a quiet, almost understated moment of acknowledgement, but it was more powerful than any promotion. The recognition was focused entirely on her competence, on the invisible labor she had made visible. By sharing the credit for his own transformation and centering her as the catalyst, Charles had done more than just praise her. He had fundamentally altered the power dynamic in the room. This quiet act opened a door, not just for Mara, but for the other staff in the house. The Davenports began to refer to all their employees by their expertise, not just their roles. The gardener became the man who understands the soil, the chef, the artist who nourishes us. It was a small shift in language, but it represented a seismic shift in culture, a culture built on the foundation of respect Mara had laid, one quiet, competent act at a time. The seasons turned. Autumn chilled the air, and the lush green of the garden faded to gold and rust. The house, once a cold monument, now felt warm, lived in, a true sanctuary against the encroaching winter. The changes Mara had set in motion had taken root, becoming the new, unspoken normal. One crisp Saturday morning, the family was getting ready for an outing to an apple orchard. There was a cheerful, relaxed bustle in the grand foyer that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Leo, bundled in a thick coat, stood patiently as his mother knelt before him. Evelyn, her movements now gentle and unhurried, took the small hand-knit gray scarf, his scarf, and wrapped it snugly around his neck. She tucked the ends into his coat, her fingers lingering for a moment in a gesture of simple, maternal affection. She stood up and turned to her husband. Charles was fumbling with his own scarf, a handsome cashmere thing he was struggling to tie correctly. With a small, fond smile, Evelyn reached out. She took the scarf from him, looped it expertly around his neck, and adjusted it so it lay perfectly against the collar of his coat. It was an intimate, caring gesture, an echo of the countless small, attentive acts she had learned by watching Mara. The symbolic object, the gray scarf, had completed its journey. Did its meaning change for you, too? It was no longer a secret totem of comfort for a lonely child, a symbol of a bond that existed in opposition to the family structure. It had been transformed. Now, it was a shared symbol, an emblem of the family's new, collective language of gentle attention and proactive care. The act of adjusting a scarf was no longer just about warmth. It was about noticing, about protecting, about loving. Mara watched the scene from the doorway, a tray of thermoses in her hands. She saw the easy affection, the quiet care. She saw a family that had learned to look after one another. Her presence was no longer required as a primary anchor, because the family had learned to be an anchor for itself. She felt a quiet, profound sense of accomplishment. She had not only healed a child, she had healed a family. She had taught them a new way to be, and the proof was there in that simple, loving gesture. She was ready for whatever came next, not because she had won a battle, but because she had quietly, patiently, and competently rendered her old role obsolete. She was no longer the sole keeper of the quiet. They were all keepers now. The final scene takes place a year later. Mara is in the main kitchen, a space that is now warm and frequently filled with the smell of baking. She is standing beside a new household employee, a young woman named Sophia, who is observing her with rapt attention. But Mara isn't teaching her how to polish silver or operate the complex appliances. She is standing by the large window that overlooks the garden, holding a cup of tea. "Watch," Mara says softly. "From 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, the sun comes through this window. It's too bright for reading in that chair." She points to one of the armchairs in the adjacent living area. "But it's perfect for warming the room before the sun sets. You learn the light, you learn the drafts, you learn the sounds. The house will tell you what it needs." Sophia nods, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. She is not being trained for a job, she is being initiated into a philosophy. "The most important work," Mara says, turning from the window, her gaze calm and steady, "is the work no one is supposed to see. It's the problem you solve before anyone knows it's a problem. That is the job." This is Mara's legacy. It isn't a plaque on a wall or a title on a business card. It is the quiet, deliberate transmission of her wisdom. It is the culture of awareness that has so completely permeated the Davenport home that it is now the standard operating procedure, the foundation upon which everything else is built. Leo runs into the kitchen, no longer a silent, anxious shadow, but a bright, chattering boy. He grabs an apple from a bowl on the counter and gives Mara a quick, easy hug before running back out, his laughter echoing down the hall. Evelyn follows him, pausing at the door to share a warm, knowing smile with Mara. It is a moment of perfect, ordinary domestic peace. The room has changed. not because the furniture has been moved, but because the people in it have learned to see. They have learned to value the quiet, the invisible, the essential. They have learned that the strength of a home is not in its flawless facade, but in the countless, unseen acts of care that hold it together. The closing image is of Mara, watching the afternoon light slant across the floorboards, a quiet, knowing smile on her face. She is at peace, her work done not because it has ended, but because it has been passed on. And the final question lingers, soft as a whisper, whose quiet excellence holds your world together, and have you ever stopped to notice?